Well, good morning and happy Halloween. You know, I can think of few more fitting or scary places to come than Washington, D.C. Now, I will note this morning, I'm not wearing an orange tie in honor of Halloween. I'm rather wearing an orange tie to celebrate what I expect will be a victory tonight in Game 6 of the World Series for the Houston Astros. Sunday night, I took my daughter Catherine to the game. Catherine just turned 7. And that game, as you'll recall, went to extra innings, and Catherine stayed up through the bottom of the 10th, through the very end of the game, went to bed at 1:30 in the morning, still cheering for the Astros to win. It has been a magical journey. And I will say for a lot of Texans, it's in particular been a meaningful journey in the wake of the disaster of Hurricane Harvey. The Texas Gulf Coast was hit badly by Harvey. My hometown of Houston was devastated by Harvey. And in the face of that devastation, we saw the state of Texas come together. We saw love and strength and unity across the state. We're rebuilding. And I'll tell you, being in the World Series and being, I hope, one game away from the first ever World Series victory for the city is really meaningful back home. It also has been encouraging seeing that Congress, despite all of the dissension and disunity we see on almost everything else, when it comes to coming together after a natural disaster, we stood as one, and the Texas delegation has stood as one. So in the state of Texas, we had the first disaster relief funding come from Congress. It came out of the House at $7.5 billion. I joined with my colleague John Cornyn in the Senate to double that funding to $15.25 billion, so that dollars became immediately available, billions of dollars, to begin the rebuilding process. Not only that, but we've seen targeted tax relief focused on hurricane relief. We've obviously got the broader tax debate, but focusing specifically on the hurricane. I introduced legislation in the Senate with John Cornyn and Marco Rubio. In the House, Kevin Brady introduced the same legislation that provided targeted tax relief at all of those areas hit by hurricanes. Texas and Louisiana and Harvey, Florida and Georgia and Irma, and Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands with Maria. And it included 4 elements. Number one, for those who had their homes damaged by the storms, they could take property damage casualty deductions on their taxes without being subject to the ordinary limitations of 10% of your adjusted gross income. It's about $5 billion in emergency tax relief for those impacted by the storms. Number 2, anyone whose homes were damaged by the storms can withdraw from their retirement, from their 401k or their IRA, to rebuild without being subject to the ordinary 10% early withdrawal penalty. Number 3, and this is a nationwide incentive for anyone giving charitable funds to charities engaged in hurricane rebuilding. Between now and December 31st, those contributions are exempt from the ordinary caps for individuals and corporations on charitable giving. And number 4, for all of those businesses that kept paying their employees in the wake of the disaster, kept the paychecks coming even though they couldn't go to work, even though the office, the business may have been underwater. The legislation includes a tax credit for having kept those paychecks going. And the Cruz, Cornyn, Rubio bill passed both houses of Congress. The president signed it into law, and so that emergency tax relief is available for the millions who were impacted by these storms. That's a positive example in Washington. There are other areas that are more frustrating. You know, I'm looking at the sign out front, jobs and growth. Jobs and growth, I believe, should be the number one priority of Congress and of the administration. My number one priority from day one has been jobs and growth. Why? It's very simple. That's the number one priority of Texans. all across the state of Texas, East Texas, West Texas, the Panhandle, the Rio Grande, everyone, jobs and growth, more jobs, higher wages, more opportunity. That unifies Texans all across the state. Now, you get jobs and growth from a number of areas. You get it from tax reform. I believe we will get tax reform done. This city is in the midst of that tax reform battle. I think it's going to take a couple of months. I think there are going to be a lot of tough trade-offs back and forth, but I believe we will get to yes because I think virtually every Republican wants to get to yes. And I am spending virtually every waking moment trying to bring Republicans together in the Senate, get to 50 out of 52 votes so we can honor our promise for a major historic tax cut that gets the economy moving and moving strong. Tax reform combined with regulatory reform are powerful, powerful forces, tools to unleashing economic growth. And when you combine that with repealing Obamacare, and I will say, even though that has had a bumpy road in 2017, I don't believe we can give up on that. I think we have to keep at it. And so I'm continuing to roll up my sleeves and work to get the job done and repeal that enormous job killer that's caused premiums to skyrocket. And then if you're focused on jobs and growth, international trade, the topic of this morning, is front and center. Texans believe in international trade. We believe in it because we benefit from it firsthand. There are about 2.2 million jobs in the state of Texas that depend on international trade. NAFTA has created millions of jobs across the United States, a great many of them in the great state of Texas. Now, as you know, we are in the midst of NAFTA renegotiations. In my view, NAFTA renegotiations can be a good thing or can be a bad thing. And it depends what the objective is of the administration and what the end point is. If the objective of the negotiations is to modernize the agreement, to modernize it for modern situations, it's over 2 decades old. If the objective of the agreement is to expand our access to Mexican markets and Canadian markets, if the objective of the agreement is to increase international trade, then NAFTA renegotiation could be a very good thing. If, on the other hand, the objective of the negotiation is to erect barriers to the U.S. markets, to decrease international trade, then I believe NAFTA renegotiation could be a very bad thing. Erecting those barriers, shutting off our markets, and as a result, shutting off the Mexican and Canadian markets would do profound damage to the American economy and to Texas in particular. Texas farmers, Texas ranchers, Texas manufacturers, Texas small businesses do well when we have access to foreign markets. Now, which direction will the administration go? I will tell you candidly, I don't know. I think there are voices within the administration pulling both directions. And so I think it depends which voices will be listened to. I can tell you my voice is emphatically urging the administration to go in the direction of expanding international trade and opening up foreign markets. There are aspects where I think this administration is already doing quite well on trade, and I expect we'll do even better. Aspects like opening up the Chinese markets. We've seen China for years putting in place non-tariff barriers that effectively close down Chinese markets. I met a couple of years ago with the senior leadership of John Deere. They talked about the enormous challenges, the virtual impossibilities of selling tractors in China. And they described that the barriers they faced were not directly on the tariff fronts, but rather were regulations specifying the terms of a tractor. And when you designed a tractor to meet those regs, they changed the regs so magically the only tractors that fit were the Chinese tractors. That's not fair, it's not right, and I do believe this administration is pressing hard to defend U.S. interest and say if you want to trade with America, you need to trade in a way that opens up your markets as well. That it's not a one-way street. On that, I'm quite optimistic. With regards to NAFTA, what I've urged the administration, I think the single greatest opportunity for NAFTA renegotiation is energy. As you know, Mexico has abundant energy resources. And yet, because of the long-standing political and legal environment in Mexico, many of those resources are not being developed. You know, many of you have seen the satellite photograph of the Korean Peninsula. Striking. South Korea brightly lit up. North Korea shrouded in almost total darkness. And the line between the two, almost as if drawn by the finger of God. It's not a meaningful natural or geographic barrier. It is simply a difference between two economic and political systems. One, a free market system, produces abundance and prosperity and wealth, and you can see the light from orbit around the earth. And the other, the failure that is communism. The poverty, the suffering, the misery, you can see the darkness. Again, miles above the earth. Well, there's a similar satellite photo of South Texas and Mexico. Not as many people have seen that photo. The Eagle Ford Shale, rich energy deposits, doesn't end at the Rio Grande. The Eagle Ford Shale extends well into Mexico. And yet the satellite picture shows north of the Rio Grande in South Texas, it's brightly lit up. Because the Eagle Ford is being developed, and that development is producing jobs, it's producing prosperity, it's producing tax revenue, which is helping the local schools. But yet you hit the Rio Grande, and because of the political and legal environment, it is far, far darker. Not quite as stark as the Korean Peninsula, but nonetheless a very clear and meaningful divide. So what I've urged the administration is use this negotiation as an opportunity to open up that Mexican energy market. When I sat down in my office and visited with the Mexican foreign minister expressed considerable interest on the part of Mexico in codifying the reforms they've made recently, opening up their energy markets. And my hope is pushing them even further, so that we incentivize developing those resources. Two things will happen if we do that. Number one, developing those resources in Mexico will produce thousands of high-paying jobs in Mexico. But number two, as they develop the resources, the place they're naturally going to look for the expertise, for the know-how to develop those resources is the United States, and in particular, my home state of Texas. Which means opening up those energy resources will produce thousands of high-paying jobs here in America. It is a win-win. That's what I believe NAFTA renegotiation should be focused on. How can we have a win-win where both trading partners are doing well, where we're producing jobs on both sides of the border? Standing here today, I don't know which path the administration will take. I know the chamber has been engaged, the business community. The business community in Texas is very engaged, very concerned that a loss of NAFTA and a loss of access to the Mexican and Canadian markets would impose massive economic costs on Texas and the United States. My hope is we don't go down that path. And I think we maximize the chances of avoiding that path if there are more and more voices instead encouraging the administration to go the second path, the path of expanding trade. Let me make one final observation. In Congress, you've got in the Senate, the Republican conference is virtually united when it comes to free trade. It's one of the most consistent things we see at our regular lunches. Indeed, the President last week joined us, Senate Republicans, for lunch. That was one of the significant topics. Indeed, the next speaker, Pat Roberts, who walked in, stood up and raised the issue of trade in the discussion last week. The Republican conference in the Senate is virtually united on that. But here's a reality. I think it is unlikely we will see significant legislative advances on the trade side. And the reason for that is I think virtually anything expanding international trade would face a Democratic filibuster. We're seeing Democratic filibusters to virtually everything. But an observation that not many have focused on. The politics of trade have changed. NAFTA famously was signed by Bill Clinton. There used to be such a thing as free trade Democrats. In the United States Senate, much like a brontosaurus, that is a species that is extinct today, you can't find a free trade Democrat anymore. I think some of that was the consequences of the last presidential election, where the last prominent free trade Democrat was Hillary Clinton. And you'll recall Hillary got pilloried by Bernie Sanders from the left precisely because her husband did sign NAFTA. And I think the remainder of the Democratic caucus looked over at what happened to Hillary and said, I don't want that to happen to me. So we have a changed terrain. I cannot think of a single Democratic senator who is a strong and outspoken defender of free trade. That's a very different terrain from a couple of decades ago. What it means is that the Democrats have the ability to filibuster any legislation, which means the action on trade is likely to play out within the administration. If Democratic filibusters obstruct any legislative action, then it's only going to be executive action that impacts trade. Executive action can have profound impacts on trade. So I want to encourage everyone in this room, let your voice be heard. Because the administration is being pulled two different directions, and if your voices are heard in unison that trade and opening up foreign markets is good for jobs, that's a message that very much needs to be heard. Thank you, God bless you, and go Astros.